Next one, please. That's right. How many of you know this place? Oh yeah. South of the border, outside Dillon, South Carolina, Ben Bernanke would come back in the summers from Harvard and put on a poncho and wait tables at south of the border. And I asked him, I said, what did you learn about work? And he said, well, you know, I learned that work is hard. Next slide, please, Parker. The greatest event that I've ever had an opportunity to cover, of course, was the attack on our country on 9/11. I just happened to be in Manhattan on that day, and when the first aircraft hit the first tower of the World Trade Center, we recognized at 60 Minutes that whatever it was, and we didn't know what it was in that moment, but whatever it was going to be a big story. And so we sent a whole bunch of people down there. And as we were heading down there, the second airplane hit, and then it became pretty apparent pretty quickly what was going on. I was running down the West Side Highway trying to get to the scene. This is as the first tower is burning and just before the second tower was hit. Thousands upon thousands of people were running up the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, trying to get out of there. And as I was running down, I kept slipping and tripping over something. There were so many people, it was such a crowd, I couldn't quite make out what it was. But after a while, there was a break in the crowd, and I noticed that it was women's high heels. Women had come out of their shoes, had left their high heels all over the West Side Highway as they were running, now barefoot or in their stocking feet, to get away from the scene. When I arrived down at the World Trade Center, the first tower had fallen by that point. I didn't know that because when you're in Manhattan, as a lot of people know, you're surrounded by buildings and you can't see a great distance. But I came around the corner and the first building had fallen, and I looked and I remember wondering, where is it? Where is the other building? The second tower to fall was actually tower number 1, and as I reached it, it was still on fire. And I looked up at the top of the building with a big television mast tower on top, and it seemed to move. And I thought it was just a trick of the heat in the light, that it was shimmering somehow. But then in that very moment, you know, people always say that these things seem to happen in slow motion, and I'm here to tell you that it's true. I watched the 110th floor fall on 109, and then fall on 108, and then fall on 107. Now, of course, that's not the way it happened. You've all seen it. The building came rushing down at near supersonic speed, but that's the way it looked. And when I realized the building was collapsing, the next rationale I had, the next rationalization that I had was, well, it'll stop. It'll fall 10 floors, it'll fall 15 floors, and then it'll stop. And then, of course, it just gathered speed as it rushed down, and that enormous hurricane of powder and dust went shooting all over everyone and everything, shooting up and down the canyons of lower Manhattan. And when that dust finally began to settle and we could see again, it was incredibly silent. It was like the first heavy snowfall of winter. Nothing was moving. We started moving toward the base of the tower at that point. And what I noticed immediately was there was nothing recognizable anywhere. Imagine the doors, the computers, the typewriters, the filing cabinets, the office furniture, the carpet. Imagine all the things that were in those buildings. And there was not one single thing that was recognizable. Not one. It had all been turned into this grayish powder, which was now blowing through the streets of lower Manhattan and beginning to drift like snow. There were drifts of 5 feet and 6 feet high of this powder. I had covered the bombing of the World Trade Center way back in 1993, and there was a fact stuck in my head from that incident. I remembered from that at any given moment, there were 25,000 people in each tower. And as I saw that tower collapsing, I thought I was witnessing the deaths of 25,000 people. And I couldn't think of anything to do but just fall to my knees in that moment and pray to God that He'd take all of those people with as little pain as possible. Now, history tells us that the evacuation of the World Trade Center towers was enormously successful. Almost everyone below the point of impact in each tower survived. No one, of course, above the point of impact was able to survive. The airplanes had cut through the building so completely. But just under 3,000 people lost their lives. 347 of those people were New York City firefighters. So many people were surprised that the buildings collapsed. I mean, steel buildings don't collapse. But we learned, of course, or were reminded, that if you burn steel hot enough, long enough, it will melt. That is, after all, how you make steel to begin with. Nobody really knew that. Nobody grasped that problem, except the 347 members of the FDNY. They'd all been trained. They knew what was going to happen. And they went into those buildings anyway. It's an amazing thing to have seen and to have experienced. About a year after 9/11, we had an opportunity to talk with President Bush, and we shot a special one-hour program for 60 minutes with President Bush on the first anniversary of 9/11 to talk about what had happened around the White House and what had happened in his day on that day. You'll remember that he was in Florida. He wasn't in Washington. He was actually at an event. He was reading to some third-grade school children when this happened. We wanted to recreate some of those moments, and he spent most of his day, as a lot of you will recall, on Air Force One, flying back up from Florida, and they frankly wanted to keep the president up in an airplane because after what had happened that morning, nobody could tell what the heck was going to be happening all around the country, and they just felt the president was safer in an airplane flying around. So they put him in Air Force One, they put fighter planes all around Air Force One, and they flew him all around the country for several hours until things began to become more clear. Parker, if you would, please. And again, if you would. One more time. There we are. This is the president walking down the aisle of Air Force One. This is a pretty nice plane that we have afforded the President of the United States, as you can see. And the aisle, instead of running down the middle, it runs down along one side. And we had an opportunity to speak with the President. One of the things that I wanted to talk to him about, one of the things that surprised me actually, when we were up in his office at the front of the airplane, near the front of the airplane, he told us about a moment that he described as one of the most difficult moments of the day. He had to make a decision, and he had to give the Air Force an order. And when he gave that order to the Air Force, it was so difficult for him, he felt like he had to be alone. And so he walked up into his stateroom, his bedroom on the airplane in order to pick up the phone and give the Air Force this order. And this is what he told us.